Welcome to everybody. It's really a pleasure to see so many familiar faces, and definitely a very, very warm thank you to Rabbi Kermaier and all of the members of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue community on a professional level, but also on a personal level. Since myself and Mushki have moved to this neighborhood about a year ago, you have been the most warm and welcoming community that we could possibly have hoped for. Also, a very special thank you to Ronn, Torossian and 5WPR for sponsoring the refreshments which will be served after the event upstairs. A lot of you here know of the Algemeiner newspaper from its history, from the last, since it was founded in 1972, for the many years that we've been around, and might be wondering, you know, what does an event like this have to do with us? So I want to just, before we go to the speakers with the questions, a few words on what we're up to now and why this is relevant specifically to us. You know, we as a media outlet, one of the primary topics that we cover is Israel and is matters relating to Israel and its situation specifically in the Middle East. The world, as we know it, is changing rapidly, specifically in areas of information proliferation and media. Concepts like the democratization of content, blogging, social media have really changed the way that we consume information and the way that media is run in today's world. We as an organization have developed our ideas on it and are constantly working to address the challenges that face Israel in the media today through perfecting cutting-edge mechanisms online, and we have seen incredible success so far. To the extent that Fox News has even described us as the fastest growing Jewish news organization in the United States. It's our mission to radically change the way Israel and Jews are presented in the media, and as such we have assembled over here 3 highly regarded communicators in what we hope will be the first of a series of discussions, but evenings really that enable us to strive on this journey of discovery together, particularly in finding compelling solutions to Israel's media problems, and really for the Jewish people to stake our position in the battleground of ideas. Our only criteria, I shouldn't say only, but one of our main criteria for this panel is that we wanted journalistic figures, meaning people that are, you know, journalist is mandated with the search for the truth, finding the truth, sometimes no matter how painful it is or how difficult it is. And we wanted people that have exemplified that in their profession and their career, people that have really made it an effort to highlight the truths about the world that we live in today, specifically with regard to Israel and the Jewish people. In general, the structure of the evening tonight, at the beginning we have some opening statements, at the end we have some closing statements. And we ask, when we pose questions to the panel, we ask that answers are kept at about 1 minute, and then in the discussions that are between us, about 30 seconds to keep the flow moving quickly. We've structured also the discussion into 3 distinct categories. So at the beginning, we want to talk about the problem. What is the nature of the problem that Israel faces, its history, its origins, etc. Then we want to talk about the cause. Why is that the case? Why has it happened? Why has it taken this direction? And then finally, hopefully we'll spend the most time talking a little bit about the solution and what we can do as individuals to address these challenges. So without further ado, let's go straight to the panel. Firstly, I want to introduce Benjamin Brafman, who really needs no introduction, one of the most famous criminal defense attorneys in this country, and quite possibly, I would say, in the world. His clients have included football star Plaxico Burress, most recently Dominic Strauss-Kahn, and also some of the most well-known business leaders of our time. Also, he is a devout Jew who has served as an exemplary member of the tribe, supports many, many Jewish causes, specifically the Hebron Fund, which is actually where we originally met. And this most proud made a young Jew to hear after he successfully defended P. Diddy, Sean Diddy Combs, achieving an acquittal on Friday afternoon. He said to all the media that were lined up, "I know that following the Super Bowl, the winning quarterback generally announces that he is now going to Disneyland. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this winning quarterback is going to synagogue. Shabbat is coming." Ben is someone who has often turned the tables on accusers in defense of the accused, and as Israel now stands in the dock of public opinion, his insights into what it will take to turn things around will most definitely be most valuable. So, Ben, your opening statements, please.
Thank you. First of all, I want to make one thing clear so that no one is confused. To the extent that throughout the evening I say anything that is viewed as even marginally critical of Israel, it comes from my heart, and it is in the form of constructive criticism. My children and grandchildren live in Jerusalem. I'm there at least 10 times a year. I was there last week. I'm going next week. So my heart is filled only with love for Israel. But I think if you love a person or a place or people as deeply as I do, you have to be willing on occasion to offer suggestions. Sometimes people don't want to hear these suggestions, but while as a criminal defense lawyer, I'm not always seeking the truth, to be candid with you. As a speaker and as an advocate on behalf of Israel, I'm trying always to speak the truth. I am deeply concerned, as I think is everyone in this room, that Israel does not do a good job in its efforts at public relations. Let's put it under that category. I think they do almost everything else so well that it bothers me that when it comes to something that important, the greatest minds in a wonderfully brilliant country are not necessarily always in the mix. And it's my hope that evenings like this are helpful. And I just want to say in my opening statement, it's gotten better, and Israel is doing a much better job than when they first began speaking publicly, but the problems have gotten worse and far more complicated. So while 20 years ago you would wince and in pain as you would watch a debate between a Palestinian scholar who graduated from Oxford and speaks a perfect English, and Israel being represented by a retired army general who speaks little, if no English, it would drive me crazy as to we're not answering the question articulately enough for someone in Kansas to understand what he is saying. I speak Hebrew and Yiddish, and I don't understand him. Israel has gotten much better, and the people who speak publicly on behalf of Israel have become much more articulate. They're much more Americanized. They get it. They do have good media skills, but I think we have several problems. One, I think, unfortunately, for so many reasons that it would take too long to list, Israel is being unfairly ostracized in a way that makes public relations a much more difficult job. Second, I don't think they're taking enough preemptive action to encounter these issues before they become disasters or public relations nightmares. And I think we'll give you an example later on of one of my pet peeves, and I think they could do a better job of creatively dealing with rabid media. And then third, and I hate to say this because I'm as proud an American as I am as a Jew, I still think that there is a measure of anti-Semitism that will always be part of the mix. Throughout the history of my life, Jewish blood has been cheap. And that's an unfortunate truth that we need to confront, fight, but recognize so that we are not ignorant when it comes to dealing with these issues. Some of the people who criticize Israel will always criticize Israel because it is a Jewish state.
Thank you, Ben, for your opening statement. Moving on to our next panelist, James Taranto. James is the editor of the Wall Street Journal's online opinion page. He's the author of the highly popular Best of the Web Today column. He's also a member of the Wall Street Journal's editorial board. And on a personal note, James, you're among the sharpest and most incisive people that I know personally. Your columns and your commentary are well known for their legendary wit and unique perspective. As a senior media professional, we're looking forward to hearing more about that perspective from you in the media.
Well, thank you. I worked in PR very briefly for less than 2 years in my early 20s, and I hated it. So I'm coming at this as somewhat of a skeptic of PR. I'm going to talk more about things from the journalistic side, and I'll be very critical of my journalistic colleagues. It seems to me that there are three basic problems that Israel has when it comes to dealing with the media. And the first one has to do with the nature of reporting from the Middle East, and the other two have to do with the nature of reporters and editors, of journalists. The first one is simply that Israel is a democracy. It's a free society, open society. There's a tradition of the press being adversarial. There's a tradition of disagreements within the country. And all of that is wonderful and healthy and so forth. But Israel's adversary, the Palestinians and the other Arabs, are not open societies. And furthermore, from the standpoint of Western reporters, they are somewhat alien. Israel is more or less a Western society. The Palestinian Arabs sort of have an exotic society that reporters don't understand all that well. So when reporters report from the Palestinian territories, they rely on fixers and handlers, minders. They rely on local stringers, and these people are often not independent. They have their own affiliations with one side. They don't have the understanding of the press as an independent entity, and so what ends up getting reported is often not of the best quality. It's just it's propaganda because it comes through this filter to reporters who perhaps don't understand the society they're reporting on well enough to see through that or to find the truth. The second problem, the second and third problem both have to do with journalists. The second problem would be anti-Semitism. Now, I don't think this is much of a problem in America. I mean, okay, we had Helen Thomas, but she was not really an influential figure. I used to call her American journalism's crazy old aunt in the attic. She was somebody who was prominent by virtue of having been around forever, and she was sort of tolerated and indulged until she just got to be so embarrassed that she had to sort of be put out to pasture. But I don't think there's a lot of real anti-Semitism in the press in America or in America as a whole. I would argue that America is the most philo-Semitic country in the world, including Israel. And I think the guys in Kansas, even if the Palestinian guy at the debate is more well-spoken and seems more sophisticated than the Israeli, I think the people in Kansas are going to side with the Israeli more often than not. But there are other countries that have journalists, and there are other countries that have deeper strains of anti-Semitism, and I think this shows up in some of the reporting from England and from continental Europe and so forth. So that is a problem. The third problem, which does affect the American press, is left-wing ideology and partisanship. And I would distinguish that from anti-Semitism, although there's some overlap when dealing with Israel. And I would make a further distinction, which is, maybe some of you saw the column this week by the worst writer in the English language, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, about Israel, in which he picked up the Walt and Mearsheimer Israel lobby canard and so forth. You know, I don't think Friedman is really antagonistic toward Israel, but he can't stand Bibi Netanyahu. A reader pointed out to me a column that Friedman had done, I believe in 1996, the first time Netanyahu was prime minister. And it was a really despicable column. It was right after Netanyahu won the election. Friedman talks about how the assassin of Yitzhak Rabin was allowed to vote because even imprisoned felons in Israel are allowed to vote. So Friedman says, no doubt he voted for Netanyahu. No evidence is offered to this. Whereas USA Today actually reported that Willie Horton was planning to vote for Michael Dukakis in 1988. They interviewed the guy. A lot of what Friedman writes is just, you know, reporting on the contents of Thomas Friedman's imagination. But he said he voted for Bibi Netanyahu. This is particularly outrageous. He had 2 votes because he killed the only labor leader who could have beaten Netanyahu. Now, like I say, when labor is in power in Israel, Friedman is a lot more pro-Israel. So it's sort of the right-left partisanship of America translated over into the Israeli context. But the broader problem is what I call oikophobia. Oikophobia is a word that
James, we're getting close to time. So
okay. Oikophobia refers to the attitude that it's sort of the opposite of xenophobia. Xenophobia is fear of or disdain for the alien. Oikophobia is fear of or disdain for the familiar. So a lot of the left in America and in Europe and in journalism feels this way about America. And the phenomenon of the self-hating Jew is a particular manifestation of this. If you've ever met these people who are called self-hating Jews, they don't hate themselves at all. They're absolutely crazy about themselves. It's that they think they're better than their own people. So I will simply conclude by saying I think these are the problems. I'm skeptical of how much you can deal with these problems by dealing with PR. I think you may just need to, it may be mostly a matter of just resigning yourself to having to deal with this and telling the truth in spite of this. You know, we heard a lot in the 2008 election about how if only we elected this fresh new president, it would improve America's image in the world. I don't see any evidence that that's the case, and I suspect that this whole prospect of dealing with this sort of thing with PR is overrated. Sorry to go long.
Ronn Torossian has built his incredible company 5W Public Relations in just 8 years into one of the largest public relations firms in the United States. Like everybody here, I'm sure you're thinking, what does 5W mean? What does it stand for? I asked the same question the first time I spoke to them. It's the 5 W's of PR. Am I right about this, Ron? Who, what, why, when, and where? Right? When, where, why. Wrong order. Ronn's clients have included Anheuser-Busch, Evian, McDonald's, and the government of Israel. He is a dedicated community activist who's a great personal friend, but also a supporter of the Algemeiner and the Gershon Jacobson Foundation. Other causes that he's very involved in include RAGE, the Russian-American Jewish Experience, Aish, and Chabad. PR is a buzzword that we hear very often about Israel. And sometimes, you know, we're not necessarily so sure what it means. PR is not a very straightforward thing. And Ron, I'm reading through your book for immediate release, a best-selling PR book that Ron has just written, and it explains some of the concepts, and I definitely recommend that everybody here go out and buy it and read it and apply it in context. But Ron, we look forward to hearing your perspective through PR.
Thank you for having me. So one of the things we're speaking about tonight is solutions on how PR can get better. So there's a man on the panel who got off DSK this summer. So if he can convince the court to get off DSK and Sean Combs and others, a start is having people like Ben, who are well-spoken on issues, speak for the issues. I'll give you two major concepts on things that I think are the problem, okay? For me, number one, I do believe is media bias / anti-Semitism. The only democracy in the Middle East is simply held to another standard. You know, whenever you read about back and forth attacks, you know, if you read about violence in Israel, it's back and forth attacks. Meanwhile, nobody called when when America bombed Iraq and everywhere else post 9/11, those weren't back and forth attacks, right? Those were not back and forth attacks. When America rightfully went after those who blew up the World Trade Center, those were not back and forth attacks. Those were not tit for tat, right? When Israel does it, it's a back and forth attack. I think that for somebody who, you know, and Ben said it as well, you know, I believe that Jewish blood is cheap. And the only country in the world, thank God, that doesn't flow with Jewish blood, where the rivers don't flow with Jewish blood, is America. The world has traditionally hated Jews, and I think that the media bias, which is a mixture of anti-Semitism and good old-fashioned liberalism, where the underdog everywhere in the world is the guy with the less power, but Israel's not the underdog. So I think that that's one issue, is media bias and anti-Semitism. From a place of love, I'll tell you that the second issue is a horrible failure to conduct public relations. PR is not viewed in Israel, communication is not viewed in Israel as something which is a must-do. You know, I have a colleague, somebody who owns one of the 3 largest PR firms in the world, okay? Humongous company, and he travels the world, and he tells me anywhere he goes, government leaders ask to meet with him. So he was in China last year, sat with a bunch of very senior government leaders. In Russia, he sat one-on-one with a number of people in Putin's cabinet. In Israel, they asked him to come in. They showed up an hour and a half late, and they told him why everything he's telling them is wrong. In Israel, if you're not familiar with, you know, in America, for example, the consul offices throughout the world cannot take a cab to meet a reporter. Can't pay for a drink to meet a reporter. So you have a government job, right? And you're making $40,000, $50,000, $60,000, and you're asked to take a cab from your own pocket to meet a reporter. If you take a reporter out for drinks, you pay for it yourself. I mean, these are very basic things. Meanwhile, our opponents, okay, our enemy in the war that we're in, has things like Al Jazeera. And if you travel in Europe, as I do, Al Jazeera is a real station. It's well done. It is, if you walk into hotels in Europe, you're watching the Al Jazeera, not about the Arab-Palestinian conflict, about the economy, about entertainment, about a number of different issues. And for all the Jewish media watchdog organizations which exist, I think that all of them probably have less impact, with all due respect, than, you know, this whole room. In other words, there's a lot of people making a lot of noise and talking about Israel's problems, and meanwhile they're not communicating. You know, when Israel has financial problems, thank God they recruited Stanley Fischer, right? Very prominent economist who turned around the economy of Israel and has done great. But when Israel has communications problems, they don't think to speak to communications experts and to people who can make a difference instead of, again, as you know, to speak instead of a retired army general who might be great on the battlefield of war, but he's not great on the battlefield of communications. So I think that Israel constantly scores an F in the school of media and the school of PR, and it's a horrible shame.
Thank you so much. It really is an honor to share the table with such distinguished panelists. Now, each of you referenced current events in your opening statements, some only vaguely and some specifically. So I wanted to just really hone in on some of the events that are transpiring as we speak, and see how those influence your perspectives on the problem of Israel and the media. Are we okay? At least I'm not in that chair. Okay. Ben and Ron, you both mentioned the inadequacy of Israel's media performance, and I think Ron, as well as James, also mentioned that that these are obviously urgent issues. I wanted to focus on the presidential election process and how your views of that process may reflect your thinking on the media problem. I think probably there is no one person in the United States that has greater access to the media than the president of this country. And how he speaks about the state of Israel obviously reflects or will influence the perspectives and the perceptions of the American public. So let me ask you, James, you said that maybe doesn't really matter in terms of how presidential occupants actually are portraying Israel or not. I'd like to hear each of you talk about how you see the current president's portrayal of Israel and its position, and how that influences the media. I'd also like you perhaps to speak about the current Republican candidates, to maybe give us your opinion as to which of those candidates will be our greatest ally as lovers of the state of Israel in terms of media and how it reports Israel. And finally, since you're going to be addressing these issues, I'd like you to perhaps weigh in if you were given the choice, and just focusing on this specific issue in terms of Israel and the media, and how these important potential leaders will help project Israel's cause in the media. Who do you think would be a better surrogate for Israel, or perhaps more damaging for Israel should it come to it? Ron Paul or President Obama?
As a trial lawyer, I sometimes try and use an example to make a point. So let me give you an example of what sometimes gets under my skin. I remember maybe 6 months ago, Israel announced that it was going to build a series of new apartments in what the world views as a settlement. And it was as if the outcry from the media was like, for example, if a presidential candidate had been accused of raping a hotel mate. The firestorm of anti-Israel publicity about its decision to build an apartment in its own land was as if it was the worst crime that had been perpetrated by a democracy in the history of America. Well, I have watched for the last year as Syria has slaughtered its own people, defenseless citizens who only want the right to be heard, and nobody cares. It's as if it doesn't matter. If Israel, defending itself, ends up by accident killing a civilian because the rocket that was launched on Sderot was launched from within a civilian enclave, specifically so that Israel's response would maybe hurt a civilian, there is condemnation the world over, and it's not just rhetoric. It is fierce, determined condemnation. Yes, everyone has said the right things about what's happening in Syria. I can quote you from Hillary Clinton to President Obama to everybody saying it's terrible. But no one has taken the condemnation to the level of rhetoric that Israel suffers every time it does something that the world perceives to be unfair or inappropriate. So that's an example of, I think, what I consider to be the different standards that the media, the government, the politicians, the world over applies to Israel. And when I say that Israel is suffering from anti-Semitism, I think my colleague on my right is correct. You know, there's a big European problem. The anti-Semitism in France is so real that French citizens are buying apartments in Jerusalem so that their children will have a place to come to when the second Holocaust comes. They really believe that it's that bad. In London, if you go to London, 70% of the people you meet are Arabs doing business in London, and Israel is condemned routinely. When the United States is in an election race, as we are now, I don't take anything that anybody says favorable to Israel seriously. And I hate when those who are trying to essentially strut their stuff patronize the Jewish population by essentially saying everything they think we want to hear, but whether they mean it or not depends on whether or not they ever get in to the Oval Office. So when I hear, you know, people like Governor Perry saying wonderful things, when I hear people like Mitt Romney saying wonderful things, when I hear people in the Obama administration suddenly start to say reasonably good things, I'm a skeptic. Forgive me, as a criminal lawyer, I'm a skeptic. I like to see boots on the ground, real action when it counts, not in the 9 months running up to an election, but every day. I'd like to see someone call it the way it is when something happens. You know, when Sderot was under rocket attack and Israel was being condemned for responding to the rocket attack and creating civilian casualties in Gaza, I spoke publicly and did a YouTube because the consul's office, in my opinion, wasn't doing a good job. And one of the things I said on there, all right, here's the logistics. We are in Midtown Manhattan, and a terrorist group in Washington Heights is shooting rockets into Midtown Manhattan. This is what would happen. The police department would say, you've got to stop it, and we mean it, and then they would launch another rocket attack, and then there would be no more Washington Heights. We wouldn't worry about collateral damage. We wouldn't worry about civilian casualties. We would carpet bomb Washington Heights. Israel could do that in 10 minutes. And if they did it after 9/11, the world would have applauded. If they went in after 9/11, when the entire world recognized that the only democracy in the Middle East that cares about human rights was Israel, and if they had taken what would now be outrageous action, the world would have said, good for you. Today, if we defend ourselves and someone is hurt in the process, you want to know how much we value human life? We gave away 2,000 terrorists to get back an Israeli soldier. No other country in the world would do that, because every life counts. And in our enemy's camp, life isn't valued, because if it was valued, you wouldn't be raising your children to blow themselves up in a pizza store just so you could kill a couple of Jewish children. So I think there is not a level playing field. I don't know whether there is anyone running for office who will be a better candidate. Ultimately, I'm not endorsing anybody tonight because I'm too much in the news for that to come back at me. And someone will hate me regardless what I say, so there's no advantage to it. And to be perfectly honest with you, it's a dishonest endorsement because I'm hearing a lot of, what I think is essentially patronizing conversation from people depending on who they're speaking to and where they are at the time they're speaking.
James, your thoughts on the president and Ron Paul and the other candidates?
Yeah, I wanted to field the Obama versus Ron Paul question because that's a fun question. It's obviously a fanciful question.
As it's relevant to the media.
Right. It's obviously a fanciful question because Ron Paul has no chance of getting the Republican nomination, much less ever being elected president. But the answer to the question is Ron Paul would be worse. And the reason Ron Paul would be worse is because not only does he really believe everything he says, but you get the sense that he is really convinced and stubborn, and if he were in there, he would actually do it. I mean, think of all of the things Obama has said. He was going to close Guantanamo. He was going to, repudiate all of Bush's policies. Very few of Bush's policies have actually been changed in terms of terrorism. If Obama had followed his own inclination, his own natural desires, I think he would have been a lot harder on Israel than he ended up being. And the reason he wasn't is for political reasons, the same reason that the Republican candidates are saying all these things like Gingrich promising to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which he probably will not do if he's elected president, because presidents always promise that, and it's not really that as simple as to carry out as it is to promise. But I think that I think we should take heart in the fact that these candidates feel the need to pander in this way. And it's not just pandering to the Jews. I think this is a crucial point. I mean, look, there aren't that many Jews who vote in Republican primaries. The Republican candidate for president is probably not going to get more than a third of the Jewish vote. Even that would be quite high. Jews tend to vote Democratic. But the reason these guys are pandering is because Israel is popular far beyond the Jewish community, and particularly among evangelical Christians who are big Republican voters. So the pandering of the politicians, while it may not translate into action, does reflect the the great amount of goodwill that the American people have toward Israel.
So if we're talking about Obama, for a long time I wouldn't visit France because of the anti-Semitism. I've stopped that a few years ago. Once Obama's here, Obama's worse than the president of France. Obama's worse on Israel than France is, so I can now have justification to visit France again. For me, when we're talking about the media perception in terms of damage done to the state of Israel, I think Obama, to put it mildly, is a disaster for the state of Israel. I do think that Hillary would have been worse for Israel, and I'll tell you why. Because in the state of Israel, Netanyahu and the government score no points by coming to the table and giving in anything to Obama. Domestically, Netanyahu can stand very strong and doesn't lose any votes, doesn't lose anything, because Obama is perceived, rightfully so, as so anti-Israel. I think that Gingrich's statement, of course, the other day was great and wonderful for Israel. But you can't ask somebody to be more Catholic than the Pope. I wasn't surprised to see he stepped back because, as the Republicans told him, well, Netanyahu wants a Palestinian state. And yes, I'm sure Netanyahu wakes up in the morning and says, wow, we need to create a Palestinian state. That's really, that's something very near and dear to his heart, I'm sure. But Gingrich, of course, stepped back and said he misspoke or whatever it is that he spoke. In terms of the media image of Israel, I think there's no question that any Republican candidate, any serious Republican candidate, so I'll dodge the Ron Paul issue, any serious Republican candidate in terms of positioning for Israel is surely better than the disaster that President Obama now has.
I want to move on now and to take a little bit back towards the discussion with regard to the media. I want to address a few questions to individuals, and if other members of the panel feel free to pitch in. This question is specifically back to James. What experience have you had among other high-level media professionals? Have you ever had a discussion about this with them? Have you noticed that there's a general acknowledgement of this particular bias? You know, is there anything you feel that could be done about that?
Well, the high-level media professionals I deal with on a day-to-day basis are my colleagues at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, whose views are, I think, much more in line with those of the people in this room than they would be at, say, the New York Times. I do a lot of public criticism of people from other organizations. Thinking of a few I've criticized specifically on the Israel issue, Roger Cohen, who writes a column that I think sometimes appears in the New York Times and sometimes only appears in the Paris edition, the International Herald Tribune, a few years ago had just some really awful columns about visiting the Jewish community in Iran and finding how much they supported the regime there and how happy they were and so forth. And it was just obvious that he was, repeating Iranian propaganda, and I criticized him very harshly for that. And interestingly, he repudiated those views later on when the protests broke out in Iran over the stolen fake election. So there's not a total imperviousness to reality, but I suspect if I were to sit down around a table with Nicholas Kristof and Thomas Friedman and Roger Cohen and Andy Rosenthal, the editorial page editor of the New York Times, I don't think I would get very far. I think these guys are pretty set in their opinions. But just to show you how unusual the Wall Street Journal is, in 1981, when Israel bombed the Osirak reactor in Iraq, everybody condemned Israel for this. Every editorial board, every country, including the Reagan administration. Now, maybe the Reagan administration didn't fully mean it. The only people, as far as I know, who praised it were the Wall Street Journal editorial page.
I want to take that question as well. I'll tell you, I think that I make a living, thank God, speaking to reporters all day, okay? With recent media cuts and recent budget cuts in TV and elsewhere, as much as we here at Fifth Avenue Synagogue and, think a certain way and would like to believe that everybody thinks day in, day out about Israel, they have a crazy job, which means they're reporting 1 minute on the DSK trial, the next minute on the New York Yankees, the next minute on Bloomberg budget cuts, and then for 4 minutes about Israel. So I do a lot of work for various politicians in Israel and others. I can't tell you how often I hear from somebody innocently, I got your guy, I have somebody from Israel, can you help me get somebody from the other side, from Hamas? For many of them, I would tell you it's not anti-Semitism. It's just a desire for the two sides in their mind to debate, and they really don't know any different. And many of them don't know the difference between the far left in Israel, a Yossi Sarid, and a Danny Danon on the right in Israel. So they're taking a representative of Israel, and they might be from the far left Meretz party and believe that that's somebody representing the Knesset of Israel, right? They just don't know these things. And I think that one of the things that I see amongst the media is just a lack of education. And let's leave, of course, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post and Fox News and the good Jewish media that's out there, the few that exist. But most people just don't think day in, day out about Israel. I mean, that's just the fact of life, right? And Israel and the Jewish community does a very poor job of educating the media about what the real fight is about and about who our voices are and should be.
Let me give you a legal view of why I think we have problem with the media. And this is just an opinion, but it's opinion based on, I think, more than 35 years of dealing with the media. And I think dealing with the media effectively, even if I say so myself. I have opened the paper and read a story about me that I'm involved in, that I was present at, and it's all wrong. And I call the reporter, and they say, sue me. We had a source. We confirmed it with a second source. That's all we need to do. And with all respect to the Wall Street Journal, who I do think is an honorable institution and does its best to, I think, give Israel a fair shake of the few world publications that are well respected, they do a good job, and I agree with that 100%. There is no accountability on many levels in terms of the media, because the way our world works in terms of legal responsibility, if you are a reporter who is protected by the First Amendment, which I think is a very important constitutional right, you really are almost immune from any kind of liability unless I can show that you acted maliciously or with reckless disregard for the truth of what you're reporting. That is an impossible burden to undertake in an evolving story where you are on the ground trying to gather facts, and you're trying to do it before deadline, and you've got 20 minutes. So you make your calls, you speak to the people who you think know, and then you report it. And people read it and think it's true. And people report it and think it's right. And then when it's wrong, there's nothing you can do. There's nowhere to go. And if you sue a giant Fortune 500 deep pocket organization that can wear down the average person and bankrupt you. It can take 5 years for your case to come to trial if it ever survives a motion to dismiss. So you have to think twice about suing. And I think that's part of the problem. A reporter knows that if they say something about Israel, either because they are uninformed or they actually have a bias, that they really have not a lot of people to answer to other than the pecking order in their own organization. Now, that's not to say there isn't any accountability. But the problem with the media that I deal with, and I'm walking out of a courthouse and I'm dealing with someone who's going live at 12 o'clock in front of the entire world, and the proceeding was over at 11:58. They don't understand what happened. They are trying to get it right, and what they report is inaccurate. And at the end of the day, people call me and say, "Oh my God, I feel so bad." I said, "Why?" He says, "I heard this terrible development." I said, "I was there." I said, "But I heard it on Channel 4. I saw it on CNN. I read it in the Post of the New York Times." And part of our problem is in an instant culture where we have no longer deadlines. The blogs are being covered live in the courtroom. Every reporter is tweeting as the events are unfolding. And when a proceeding starts and how it ends could be 2 hours in between. So the bad stuff gets out and everyone sees it. And then by the end of the day, the story has changed, but it's a whole different audience. I've talked myself blue in the face about this issue. I don't think there's a remedy. I don't want to stifle the press. I respect the press. I think most reporters try their best to get it right. But I go back to what I said in my opening statement. I stand by this. When it comes to Israel, there is another element that enters into the mix. Not necessarily with the Wall Street Journal or the New York Post, but with most of the other media outlets throughout the world, from CNN to French news to European news to BBC. There is a bias. The story is not reported fairly. I cannot tell you how many times in the last 365 days I have seen a picture in the New York Times of a Palestinian child who was struck by shrapnel. I never see a family in Sderot whose house was destroyed. And on the occasion, when you do see that, it's never a big story. It's a passing story. So I think there's a media bias. I think there is anti-Semitism. And I think the proof, quite frankly, is, to me, it's kind of obvious, to be honest with you.
I would just like to say a word on behalf of the First Amendment. It's quite right that it's almost impossible for a public figure to win a libel lawsuit in the United States. This is because of a string of Supreme Court decisions beginning with New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964 that sets out a very rigorous standard of what they call actual malice. England has a much more pro-plaintiff regime. Truth is still a defense, but the burden of proof is on the defendant. And an issue has come up recently of what's called libel tourism. There's a woman named Rachel Ehrenfeld who wrote a book about terror funding. She was sued in an English court by a Saudi tycoon. She thought the suit was meritless. I have no opinion, by the way, on the merits of the lawsuit, but she didn't defend the lawsuit, so now there's a judgment against her in England. She can't visit England, and this is a problem that people who are concerned with with Israel and with fighting terrorism raised. A similar issue comes up with hate crime laws, which were originally instituted as a defense against anti-Semitism and now are increasingly being used to counter criticism of Islam. When you have a legal tool like this, your enemies can use it too, so be careful what you wish for.
When the charges against DSK were dropped, since you mentioned it, I think we understand that to a great degree it resulted from absolutely discrediting the opposition. We've referenced the current primaries, and Newt Gingrich in particular, a couple of times, and there is an ongoing debate there in terms of public relations as to what works best. Is it promoting your positive agenda, or is it tearing down the opposition or the enemy, as the case may be? Conventional wisdom in politics has always been, and it's been borne out, that negative attacks seem to yield results. Bottom line. So let me ask you, Ben, and also James and Ron, from different perspectives, is the cause of Israel's media problem simply that they're ineffectively promoting all of their positives, everything that they bring to the world? Or is the problem really that they don't take off their gloves and expose the enemy for the vicious reality that it really is? Or put differently, does Israel essentially go along with media distortions and treating vicious enemies as moderates when their image would be better served by simply exposing the extremists for who they are?
I really hope that that's the last time tonight that there's any reference to the DSK case, and I will tell you, Rabbi, with respect, that in that case it was not as a result of us discrediting the opposition. It was as a result of the opposition discrediting itself. The case essentially imploded. Of course, there was no case. So let me at least make that clear, because this is on tape. But let me tell you. Well, that happens to be true. I know. Trust me. So.
This illustrates your past point.
There aren't a lot of things I know about. That I know about. I think it's more complicated, Rabbi, because you sort of Israel is damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. And that's part of the problem. Israel does a terrific job of promoting tourism. It does a terrific job of promoting its technology, a terrific job of promoting its cancer research and the wonderful accomplishments that they have. And I think the world understands that. I think, you still have, most anti-Semites feel comfortable having a Jewish doctor. It's just a fact of life. I see it hundreds and hundreds of times being involved in Israel cancer research where, Arabs come to me and say, will you help us? And I think it's more than that they only promote themselves. It's lonely when you're Israel. Israel needs help condemning the bad guys. Israel can't be the only voice out there saying that the other side are terrorists. Countries like the United States, like democracies in Europe, who should know better, who are filled with intelligent, educated people, they're not stupid. They get it. They just don't want to deal with it. There's an intellectual dishonesty that is frightening. I mean, I sometimes worry that it's part of our fault. We are raising kids, many, who are going to great universities who don't know anything about Israel. And the first time they are confronted by the horrors of the Palestinian refugees, they don't know how to answer the question. They haven't read. They haven't been told by their parents. Parents are afraid to raise the issue. We're raising a generation of brilliant Jews who are ignorant about the issues that are affecting Israel. So I think it's incumbent on the people in this room, and I've spoken about this everywhere. But I got to tell you, in order to promote yourself and your accomplishments, you can do that on your own. In order to condemn the opposition when you're dealing with an international issue, you need help from the international community. And Israel doesn't have it. They used to have it in the United States. and it meant a great deal. Now they really don't have it in the United States, and that really has hurt their standing, because if they don't have it in the United States, why should France do it? Why should England do it? Why should Switzerland get involved if the United States, Israel's greatest ally, is essentially walking away? And the issue is a complicated one. For Israel to condemn a terrorist who blows up a pizza store and kills innocent children, does Israel really have to do that? Shouldn't the world understand that that's a bad thing, and that you can't make peace with an enemy who thinks that's a good thing, you know, to do? We really have to have an intelligent discussion about that. And the Palestinians got smarter. They got smarter, quite frankly. They stopped for a time being all of these suicide bombings because they recognize that if they give the appearance that they're reasonable, maybe people like the United States will sit down and talk to them as reasonable people. There is a statement in the New York Times today by the leader of Hamas saying in the New York Times that he will never recognize Israel's right to exist. Not yesterday, today. It's a small column on the right-hand side in the middle of the foreign relations section. So who am I going to talk to? Who am I going to sit down at a table with? Someone who denies me the right to live? Someone who tells me that I should, and all of my family should either die or leave? I mean, I'm embarrassed sometimes when I have this debate with intelligent people, many of them who are Jewish, and they say to me, why don't you just sit down across the table from Hamas and make peace? I said, because they want me dead. That's why. And when someone wants you dead, you have two choices. Either run away or kill them. And Israel can't run away because most of the people who make up Israel today are the children of people who never got the chance to run away. They were murdered only because they were Jews.
I have a fun little story to illustrate the point you just made about needing help to condemn. How many people remember who Rachel Corrie was? A lot of you. Rachel Corrie, for those of you who don't remember, was this dopey 23-year-old girl from Olympia, Washington, who joined the International Solidarity Movement, which is this far-left group, went to Gaza in 2003, and started interposing herself between Israeli IDF bulldozers and weapons smuggling tunnels that the bulldozers were filling in. So she's standing there in front of the bulldozer. The bulldozer driver has a blind spot, doesn't see her, runs over her. You know, she ends up crushed flat and killed. And I read about this in the Jerusalem Post, and I thought, oh God, we're never going to hear the end of this. This girl is going to be, you know, the poor little martyr. So I made a decision to go negative on her. I wrote up an item for my column in a sort of jaunty tone. The headline was, Terror Advocate Dies in Accident. I described her in condescendingly sympathetic ways, you know, saying she was very foolish and didn't know any better and so forth. And then I kept returning to this subject, and just, you know, as things came out, there were photos of her with little Palestinian children burning an American flag made of construction paper. And I mean, in some cases, I resorted to really cruel humor. There was another story about some guy who his hat had flown off his head in a wind gust, and he was in a parking lot, and he ran out to grab his hat, and he ran in front of a truck and was run over by the truck. And I said, kind of reminds me of Rachel Corrie, except that he died in the pursuit of something worthwhile. So now the point I'm making with this story is I don't think it would have done for an Israeli government official or spokesman to do this. I think it would have looked mean and juvenile, and it would have reinforced the worst perceptions about Israel. I can do it because I'm a funny, edgy columnist, and I can say pretty much whatever I want. But you know, there are certain things that are expected of people in positions of authority, and so they can't do everything.
Ron, I want to address a question specifically to you. There's this term, you know, especially, you see me on that side? No? When it comes to Israel's scenario in the media, the term that people always use, what's wrong with Israel's PR? What's wrong with Israel's PR? Israel's PR, Israel's PR, Israel's PR. question to you, Ron, is can you, first of all, explain what PR actually is? And what are the mechanisms that our opponents are using through PR that we're failing to use? What are the consequences? And what can we do about it? We had a story recently that for the UN unilateral declaration of independence for the Palestinian people, they actually hired a very prestigious public relations firm called Bell Pottinger, based out of the UK, and we wrote a story about it. They refused to comment on it. They had represented some other dubious causes. But Ron, what are the effects of it? What is it? And how can we apply it?
So public relations shapes minds, builds brands, amongst many other things that I describe in my new book that I'd love for you to go get for immediate release. I think that Israel does with love, I'll say, I think that Israel does an awful job in public relations. So we'll remember the flotilla of a few years ago? I remember when it happened, within an hour, when the flotilla happened and Israel started taking heat, within an hour, I called a friend who's a very senior government minister in Israel. I told him, where's the video? Okay? He told me, well, it hasn't gone through military clearance yet. So if you'll remember that situation, it took 2 days for that video to come out. And when it came out with Hebrew subtitles. Hebrew subtitles. 2 days later, in a world of tweeting and blogging and all of the rest. So, while I think that my colleague to the left here is correct in stating that Israel needs help from its friends, Israel also has to do more to help themselves. When we look at our opponents, and yes, there are opponents, they are using media outlets like Al Jazeera, in which $300 million was invested to start. They are using public relations firms, communications experts, they're whining and dining reporters. The concept in the Middle East of expense reports for the Arab countries is a little bit different than it is for those who work at the Israeli consulate and in Jewish media worldwide. And I think that Israel across the board just has to do more to help themselves. They have to have spokespeople. If you're familiar with it, Israel has consuls who go to countries and don't speak the host language. I mean, how many years ago was it here in New York, we had a consul who didn't speak English? You remember that? No. Yes, absolutely. Happened last year in Russia, where the consul that they sent to Russia didn't speak Russian. So let's not talk about high-level activities. I think that Israel simply has to take a very simple, things like media training, things like communications training, telling the story, realizing that a part of a military battle these days, as we should have learned from the Middle East this summer, where we see revolution in large part, they call them Twitter revolutions and other things, where you're seeing governments overthrown because of PR and media. Israel simply has to realize that a part of battle today is public relations and media and managing the media. And I hope and pray that Israel will get better at it.
I'd like to add something, and that I actually read Ronn's book and reviewed it, and it's a masterpiece. And I'm not saying that because he's here. What he does is he takes public relations and he destroys the mystique. It's not that mysterious. He explains it, and I think if he can explain it so that I can understand it, I think the government of Israel should have a copy of it on everybody's desk. But I want to add something to what Ron said, and it's this point I raised earlier privately about the flotilla as a perfect example. One of the things that's, I think, also important in public relations is not only after-the-fact public relations, but preemptive public relations. Let me give you a perfect example in what I think is just like plain, the word in Yiddish is, in Hebrew and in Yiddish is pashut. It's plain and simple. He said, you have a blockade, a naval blockade of Gaza. How many people in the world really knew about that until the flotilla? You are about to encounter a group of ships that you have reason to believe from intelligence reports are not going to stop. They're going to try and break the blockade. You have a legal right for the blockade. Everyone says that. And you have a legal right to board the ship because you want to inspect not the humanitarian aid that you're going to stop. You're not going to stop it. You will allow them to offload it. You're checking for weapons that we know have been smuggled into Gaza for the last 10 years. You have to be concerned that maybe this turns into a confrontation where blood will be spilled. take the preemptive strike before you board the boat. The United States of America should be told, CNN should be told, we have a ship coming towards Gaza that we must stop. We did it in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We knew for months that we were going to stop these ships when they were close enough to Cuba. President Kennedy was on the news every day telling us that they're going to board these ships and it might result in war. You know you're boarding a flotilla. You're boarding it with armed soldiers. You don't know who's going to be on there. You have reason to suspect that bad people may be on there. If you alert the world to the mission is to board the boat to check for weapons. We're not looking to hurt anybody. We're not looking for a confrontation. Israel is the only country in the world that sends in special forces with rubber bullets. Why? Because we're trying to minimize casualty. But we, as Ron says, nobody knew this. All we knew about was armed Israeli soldiers ended up killing unarmed civilian activists. And the world condemned Israel, and they've never gotten over it, and people still talk about it. All you needed was an 18-hour window. We're going to board these boats. We're not looking to hurt anybody. We hope that they will allow us to search for weapons. If there are no weapons, the boat will be allowed to proceed and unload its cargo. We have been given legal permission to create this blockade because it's the right thing we can do in a war zone. We do, United States does it all the time. But nobody knew what happened. By the time people learned what happened, it was, you know, grainy film with Hebrew subtitles that people claimed was doctored because it was propaganda. You lose. If you preempt it, you can't lose. If something bad happens, you've tried to diffuse it before it happened. You've tried to explain that this is not your objective. Israel isn't going around looking to kill people who aren't looking to harm them. That's not what Israel is about.
One of the things I always tell reporters, anytime I read, issues like this, I always say to them, what would happen if I took a few activist friends and took a boat to Guantanamo Bay? Would the police shoot me as they should? If I were to take a boat towards Rikers Island or towards Canada, what does one think would happen? And it's only in the Middle East, it's only in the state of Israel, where there's a double standard when something is legal and they legally stop them. But, again, it's a two-step process, as I said at the outset. As Ben rightfully said, preemptively tell the story, and media bias, and I think it's shameful.
I don't know, I think I want to dissent a bit on the flotilla thing. First of all, I knew what was going on beforehand. I didn't do original reporting on it. I mean, it had been in the press. It wasn't covered as widely or as sensationally as the actual confrontation was, because an actual confrontation is a bigger story than a threatened confrontation. And I think that putting your story out there and telling it in a way that makes your case as strongly as you can is certainly a necessary and important thing to do. I don't think it's going to overcome media people who are biased against you. So I don't think there's that much more that Israel could have done in terms of making the case beforehand. In terms of what happened after, it seems to me this was what, last year, the summer of 2010? So this year we were supposed to have another round of flotillas, and it never happened for whatever reason. I didn't follow this closely enough to say exactly, but I think the Greek government got involved in stopping some that were supposed to be leaving from one of their ports. So I assume that what happened was a matter of diplomacy rather than public relations. But my sense is the whole thing blew over, and it was not. Israel got some bad publicity out of it, but the blockade stands, and I don't think it was in any way a disaster for Israel.
I tell my clients, be careful what you send in an email, because you can never delete an email. Somewhere it's floating out there. You don't know where it went. You don't know who got it and who forwarded it. It's blown over. But if you do research as a college student and you try and find recent controversy, confrontation, and you begin going to the blogs and going to the clips and going to this story, as a college student, you would think that Israeli soldiers butchered, a couple of people who were unarmed. And if you go through the story and you read for another 6 months, maybe you'll get to a better story. But at the outset, we're very quick. We make decisions real quick. If you get an assignment, look up the Gaza flotilla, you hit it, you get 10,000 million hits, and they're all going to be bad. But if you have a couple of hundred preceding it, where Israel, I understand, he's right. If it's not a story if Benjamin Netanyahu stands up and says, this is disaster we're trying to avert. It's not going to make the front page of the Times like the actual confrontation did, but at least we're on record. At least we can go to the videotape and say, we tried to tell you. No one would listen. And I think it's an important part of the mystery of why Israel suffers from such unfair press, because we've got creative minds in that country doing so many wonderful things, but when it comes to this, it's like Ron said it before, they don't think it matters. It matters. The perception and the reality sometimes merge. No one knows what the reality is, and the perception is what carries the day, even if it's wrong.
I want to move now into a completely different zone with one final question to the panel, and then following that we'll take some questions from the audience. And the question is as follows. Moving away completely from the problem and the difficulties that we're dealing with, the question focuses around solution and what can actually be done in an ideal world, and also with the resources that we do have at our disposal. And there are a number of efforts that have been initiated, including the efforts there are some TV channels that have been started by various Russian oligarchs, which have been branded as Israel's answer to Al Jazeera. A fellow called Igor Kolomoisky in Ukraine and Alexander Maskevich. The question is as follows. What would it take for something like this to succeed? Is it a question of money? Do the Arabs simply have more money than the Jews to invest in these projects? Are they perhaps more unified? Or is this not the direction to go? Really, in summation, the question is, how do you solve this crisis, both if you had unlimited funds and also based on the resources that are available to the Jewish community? And if we can have 2 minutes from each of you, and then we'll go to questions from the audience.
I'm not certain that there is a simple solution to something this complex, but let me suggest a couple of things. Part of our problem is Israel is burdened by speaking the truth, and the response from a dictatorship who can kill its own people with no repercussions isn't burdened by the truth. So whatever is said on Al Jazeera can be the party line of the day, can be completely propaganda. Whatever comes out of Syrian TV, to its own people they lie, to the world they lie. Israel doesn't do that. So Israel speaks the truth, and they take their blemishes and they accept them when appropriate, and they criticize their own. The president of Israel is going to prison or is in prison because Israel prosecuted their president for a sexual assault case. The United States had a president who committed what may have been a sexual crime in the Oval Office, and he wasn't even impeached. So Israel speaks the truth, and I think, to be perfectly candid with you, that's what makes me so proud of this country. But when you speak the truth and the other side doesn't, you're at a real disadvantage, because no one is playing by this. The adversary isn't playing by the same rules. I don't think it's simply a question of resources, because when Israel really needs resources, we find them. When we need resources, some group like Amit or Amuna or American Friends of every organization in Israel, we find the funds. Throwing funds at a problem isn't always the answer. Recognizing that you have a problem, figuring out a game plan, and then funding it, that's I think the solution. And it doesn't only have to come from the Algemeiner journal, and it doesn't only have to come from Russian oligarchs. It has to come from mainstream media in Israel, and mainstream media in the United States, and mainstream media in Europe and throughout the world. And if you want to see a measure of anti-Semitism that is so apparent it sort of shocks the conscience, as I would say, watch how a story on Israel is covered by BBC. It's like stunning to me what a bias is so obvious that I'm surprised that real journalists from throughout the world don't point the finger and condemn them. And you know, history, and I credit the Wall Street Journal, because when they bombed Osirak, I think the only member perhaps in the United States was the late Stephen Solars, who actually spoke in defense of Israel. He recently passed away, and he was a very good friend. But imagine the Gulf War if we had not taken out what was then an almost functioning nuclear reactor. But you know what? Israel was condemned by the entire world, with the exception of people at the Wall Street Journal. But the entire world saw Israel as a warmonger. You know what happened? They saved thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of American lives when we invaded Iraq to save, when we went to rescue Kuwait after it was invaded by Iraq. If they had a nuclear weapon at the time, do any of you doubt that Saddam Hussein at the end of his reign would have pressed the button? Does anybody doubt that Ahmadinejad would hesitate to annihilate Israel if he thought he could? And yet the world talks about this, and they say this is really Israel's problem. It's the United States' problem. And the United States needs to have a joint position on this with Israel. They say the right things, and God only knows if they're planning a military operation, if they get it. A military operation, based on what I know, may not even be a viable alternative, but you've got to do something, because if they become a nuclear power, I think the balance of power in the world changes, and it never gets leveled again.
So, Dovid, the premise of your question is that the Jews don't control the media. just to be clear on that. I guess I would break this up into three parts. The first is the European media, the BBC and other things like that. I don't know what to do about that. That seems to me to be a tough nut to crack. Since we've mentioned Al Jazeera, I guess I'll put in a good word for Al Jazeera. I think it's a huge improvement over other Arab media. I mean, it's a basically independent news organization, except that I understand they never criticize their own government of Qatar, but they do some serious coverage of other Arab governments. They interview Israeli politicians, so they at least don't pretend that Israel doesn't exist. It's obviously there's a lot to criticize about it. I'm not saying it's better than, say, the BBC, but, you know, from where they're coming from in the Arab world, I think it's an encouraging development, the existence of Al Jazeera. In the U.S., the problem, you mentioned the term mainstream media. The problem is the mainstream media are not really all that mainstream in terms of reflecting the political outlook of America as a whole. They reflect one side, and they reflect, in some ways, the extremes of one side, so that most of the major networks and newspapers are very left-wing, and the left is increasingly hostile to Israel for reasons of you know, sympathy with third world movements, sympathy with the underdog. You can describe it in a lot of different ways. So I think the answer in the U.S. is just to hold the media more accountable and point out where they get it wrong, and that's certainly what I try to do a lot of in my column. And there is a reason why the Wall Street Journal is about the only newspaper in the country whose circulation is growing, and this is part of it. Pardon the plug.
You know, sitting with a journalist, with a top-tier journalist and a top-tier litigation attorney, sitting with a journalist and a top-tier litigation attorney, you know, I learned that I can't sue a paper, and anybody can say what they want, right? Those are universals that I'll trust. Anybody can right now tweet anything they'd like, very little recourse. You can blog what you want, very little recourse. For that reason, I'll tell you that Israel needs to do a much better job of utilizing allies. While we realize that an ally might not necessarily be in the New York Times or in the BBC, I would argue to you that one of the foremost things that can be done is to use a place like the Algemeiner and other places that are friendly to plant issues that matter. Now, the trick is not to talk to an audience like this who walks in and is going to say whatever those guys say is great, because, you know, most of the people in this room already agree with what we're going to say here. The trick is to reach people. The trick is to reach people through outlets that are friendly, that, you know, are the swing vote, if you will, are the people who aren't decided on these issues. I think that that's a start. I think that Israel, you know, and the major American Jewish organizations pay a lot of lip service to PR and to publicity. Meanwhile, they've rarely called people like, forget me, Dan Edelman or Howard Rubenstein, who own very large, very successful PR firms. They are pro-Israel, Jewish guys, and I guarantee you that the government of Israel has never invited them in to speak. I guarantee you that, with all due respect to the Conference of Presidents and other major American Jewish organizations, they've never locked them in a room and said, guys, we need 8 hours of your time to help us with messaging, with training. What they have done constantly, and what they do to me is every time I sit with them, is they tell me, yeah, but you don't understand this. Yeah, but you don't understand that. And so it's gotten to the point where, you know, I've met with every prime minister multiple times on PR, and every mayor of Jerusalem, and every mayor of Tel Aviv, and every mayor and every conference of presidents organization. And meanwhile, they all tell me about the great PR movements they're doing and about media watch this and media watch that. And, you know, I think that they all just, you know, with all due respect, they're very ineffectual. They're not ineffectual. They might reach, you know, they might convince people at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue and great synagogues like that to send letters to the New York Times. Great. How many people are they reaching, you know, to influence and to change their mind? Very, 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 very few. So I think that you need a revolution in the Jewish media world. You need a revolution, complete revolution. It's not a problem. It's a revolution in the Jewish media world and in the Israel and in the way that Israel approaches, you know, diplomacy on a, you know, very small issue. You look last week at these commercials that the Israel Immigration Authority issued, talking about, you know, stupidity. It's the height of stupidity. In other words, you know, if you're not familiar with these videos, they, you know, talk about Israelis marrying American Jews, and these reached mainstream media. Why would you bother to? It's not stupidity. It's beyond stupidity. I mean, I think that, and of course, the consul general didn't know anything about it, and the minister of foreign affairs didn't know anything about it. And by the way, the minister of health in Israel can come and talk about the Palestinian-Israel peace process here in the States. So I've been employed by individual government ministers who tell me, call the Wall Street Journal, call the New York Times, and get us a meeting. And then the ambassador will call me and say, we don't represent the government. And I'll tell them, well, then call your minister and tell him that I don't represent the government, because he told me to do it. So, you know, there's a lot of very big issues that need to be taken seriously. And I think, you know, the same way in the military, you have a chain of command. You have a chain of command in the military about who can do what. I think that within the government of Israel, and to a degree within the American Jewish community, you need that. Otherwise, nothing's going to change anytime soon.
Can I share a... I feel compelled to share a story because I want to make a point, because, you know, I really love the country, and I really love its people, and I think part of what I love about the people is that they're tough people. They're tough because if they weren't, they would have been destroyed a long time ago. But part of the problem, I think, is the culture. Part of the personality of the Israeli is I've got to sort of be in your face in order to make a point. And I think we are now at a point in time where that has to be toned down a little bit. You don't always have to seek confrontation with someone who is trying to help you. You need to win them over without confrontation. So I'll give you a perfect example. It's a personal story. I just think it's great. I'm in a restaurant in Israel. I like ice with my Diet Coke. I like cold ice. It's very hard to get ice in Israel with the soda. So I say to this young Israeli waitress, and I'm not an Adam Chashuv, I'm not an important person in Israel, but I'm, you know, like 63 years old, I'm not a kid. I'm talking to a 19-year-old, and I say, Ani rotzeh kerach b'vakasha. I said, I'd like ice with my soda, please. And she brings me one ice cube, and I say, I would like a lot of ice. And she looks at me and she says, are you stupid? And I said, I don't think so. Why? She says, because if I give you more ice, you will have less soda. And in Israel, no Israeli would tolerate that. I said, but I like it. Why is that? Ice is free. This is something you should be willing to accommodate an American who comes here to spend a lot of money. So I said to her afterwards, I said, let me tell you, I was a waiter in college. Let me tell you how I would handle that. I said, you sure you want so much ice? Because it's going to dilute the soda. And if you want the ice, I'll give it to you, but I think it's better without so much ice. Isn't that better than asking me if I'm stupid? And you know what the problem was? She looked at me like I was even more stupid. So I think, look, that is an old story. It's 20 years ago. It's different. It's changed. They get it. I think they're learning. It's an impossible position that the people of Israel are in. My great uncle, who survived Auschwitz, was in the army for 50 years. Before he died, he said to me, I was hoping that after fighting 4 wars, that my grandchildren or children would not have to be soldiers. And right now, Binyamin, he said to me, I have a son, a grandson, and a great-grandson in the army. And will it ever be better? And I think that's something that the world doesn't really understand. We fight a war with our children, and we take it seriously. We're fighting for survival.